Welcome to True Diversity Film Series, Standing in Solidarity. My name is Donna Walker Kuhn. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm Senior Advisor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at New Jersey Performing Arts Center. This evening, our discussion is titled, Enforcing Justice, Mitigating Disparities in Our Criminal Justice System. Tonight's panel was curated by Amal Sinha, Executive Director of ACLU New Jersey. I also hope you were able to watch the film Just Mercy, which provides a foundation for our discussion. It was provided for you in the registration link. This social justice series is part of our Standing in Solidarity initiative. The purpose of this series is to bring our community together and to encourage everyone to take part in the movement to ensure civil rights for all. On our website, you can find archived prior social justice panel discussions as well as resources that will help you take action. We are also very happy to have as our advisors the Asian American Arts Alliance, ACLU New Jersey, Newark NAACP, the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, Newark Arts, the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Center at Rutgers University, Newark, and the Africana Institute at Essex County College. Now, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. The language we're using was created with consultation and guidance from Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape Munsee tribe and Oleana Whispering Dove, the Eastern Salagi Algonquin descendants. We're grateful to them for their generosity, wisdom, and labor to craft these words. We, the Lenape, original benefactors of land once ripened and cultivated with attentiveness to the Creator and her ascendancy, express everlasting gratitude to our Creator for the traditional ancestral jurisdictions of the Munsee, Esopus, Canarsie, Capsee, Warpos, Siwanoy, and Weekasqueak, jointly known today as the Ramapo and Natikote Lene Lenape. We are the Lene Lenape Hoking today and will be for the remaining days of tomorrow, keepers of the past. Let this moment of recognition be a monument of action. Let it be the beginning of hope for this, our turtle island, and for the Rampopo Lenape, the Muncie people, of whose land we now trod. Here on this land, in this place of the Muncie, we acknowledge our debt to those who have come before us, to those who've been denigrated and suffered for the sake of cultural and land appropriation. Let this, our land acknowledgement, be the beginning of our return to unity. Let us be guardians of the water, the air, and the earth, the four-legged, the flyers, the swimmers, the crawlers, the mammal people, and the green. Let us now stand lifting our humanity, enrapturing with Earth's consciousness as guardians of harmony and kindness. This acknowledgement demonstrates our ongoing commitment as a community, working to dismantle the continued legacies of colonialism, oppression, and systemic racism. We offer a pledge of social justice awakening and education in order to raise the level of awareness and to ultimately strengthen the communal fabric, which includes our engagement with our Indigenous neighbors. Thank you. NJPAC would also like to thank our corporate sponsor, PSEG, for standing in solidarity, our True Diversity film series. They have consistently provided resources that enables us to produce this important work. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's panel, Amal Sinha. Amal is a nationally recognized civil rights leader who has dedicated his career to advancing racial justice, holding institutions accountable, and promoting and defending rights and liberty. As executive director of the ACLU New Jersey, Amal leads a team of dedicated professionals and guides the organization's innovative integrated advocacy work, utilizing litigation, policy, public education, and strategic communications to build a more equitable society. Amal is actively involved in the South Asian American community, including having served as the president of the South Asian Bar Association of New York, where he led efforts to shape the organization's public interest community and programming. Amal is a treasure. We deeply appreciate all of his support and efforts in helping us to build our Standing in Solidarity social justice platforms. Please welcome Amal Sinha. Thank you, Amal.
Thank you so much, Donna. I really, really appreciate that kind introduction. And good evening, everybody. This is probably my fourth or fifth time leading a conversation in this series, and I'm just so grateful for the opportunity because we get to take on some rather challenging and important topics, and tonight's conversation is no exception. And it's a conversation where we'll do some real meaningful truth-telling, and we are not in the business of mincing words at the ACLU or across the partner organizations and individuals that we have on this panel today. Let me start by saying this. I'll frame out the conversation and then we'll dive into the panel. In the days, weeks, and months following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, lawmakers and leaders and politicians at every level of government called the instance a tragedy and called for change. We saw sustained protests with officials, including law enforcement themselves, joining in some instances. For a moment, I thought that something might actually happen, that we would see meaningful reform and accountability, that we would see something change. But nothing happened. The calls went largely unanswered. Just last month, the world witnessed yet another egregious killing by police, and this time of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, who was brutally beaten and killed by several police officers. And as with the summer of 2020, we saw the same thing. We saw calls for change at every level, from the local council member all the way up to the President of the United States during his State of the Union address. And yet again, those calls have gone unanswered. Not only has nothing changed, it seems that by some accounts, things have gotten worse. 2022 marked the deadliest year for police violence in recorded history in the United States, with Black Americans 3 times more likely to die at the hands of police than white folks. And when it comes to police violence, America is the country of tragedy compounded. Not only do we have seemingly constant police brutality intersecting with systemic racism, we also have inadequate ways of dealing with it and holding institutions accountable. And we have a politics that refuses to even sufficiently acknowledge the harm. In New Jersey, in the 2.5 years since George Floyd's death, the only meaningful piece of legislation to hold police accountable that has passed is a police licensing scheme, which, by the way, we were state number 47 to do. We still don't have civilian oversight over police departments. We don't have legislation mandating disclosure of police disciplinary records. We haven't outlawed chokeholds by police, and we still have qualified immunity blocking legal accountability across the country. However, in New Jersey, we've also been at the forefront of some pretty remarkable change. We were one of the first states to embrace bail reform and effectively end cash bail. We've significantly reduced the use of solitary confinement in our prisons. We've ended extreme sentences for young people. And perhaps most dramatically, because of the work led by the ACLU and many of our partners, including Salvation and Social Justice, New Jersey Prison Watch, and others, some of whom are on today's panel, during COVID-19, New Jersey reduced our prison population by more than 35%. That's over 9,000 people who have returned home early during the past 2 years as a result of the public health emergency and legislation that led to their release. No other state was able to do anything like that. Meanwhile, though, across the country and in New Jersey, we've seen a new push for tough on crime policies, giving the police more power, increased penalties, and potentially incarcerating more people. There's a paradox here. Just as we think we're getting somewhat better, moving somewhat forward, we're falling backwards. And just as we think we've evolved out of a moment, history repeats itself. And it's on us to disrupt that vicious cycle. And to talk about how to do it, we have an esteemed panel. As I introduce each speaker, I would love for each of them to come off video and off mute, and in about a minute or less, describe their work and the mission of their organization and the mission of their work. So first we have Reverend Dr. Charles Boyer, who's the founder of Salvation and Social Justice and just a righteous advocate. Reverend Boyer, would you please share a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you to NJPAC. Certainly thank you, Amal, all of my co-panelists, my dear sister Nafisa. Charles Boyer, again, founder of Salvation and Social Justice, co-founder along with my wife, Rosalie. I'm also pastor of Greater Mount Zion African Methodist Episcopal Church in Trenton. It is the oldest and longest standing Black institution in the city and one of the oldest in the state. Salvation and Social Justice comes to public policy work through the lens of Black faith, knowing that the Black church in particular has always been involved in the liberation of Black people. And so our theory of change works with dealing directly with folks most impacted, particularly from a Black faith lens, working with folks to hear their lament, move towards liberation, craft public policy as a result, and then advocate for change. And so we are grateful, as Amal lifted up several of the things that we have worked on together to bring about liberation for Black people in the state. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Rev. Next, we have Nafisa Goldsmith, who's currently the COO of Youth Function Over Form. Nafisa, can you talk a little bit about your work?
Certainly. Good evening. Yes, I am the COO of Youth Function Over Form, and our mission is just based in the ministry of presence. And what that means is, for our young people, we want to create pathways that prevent and also disrupt any opportunities to become an incarcerated citizen. It has to stop. And so when we talk about the ministry of presence, it's being able to not only mentor and be there, right? Be present for our young people, but also to be present in our criminal legal system. We have individuals who were directly impacted as children who are now leading the charge and the change. And when we look at prisons, we must know that our children are considered the next inhabitants of those spaces, but not on my watch. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nafisa. Next, we have Jim Sullivan, my colleague at the ACLU of New Jersey, where he serves as Deputy Policy Director. Jim, can you say a few words about your work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amal. As Amal said, I am the Deputy Policy Director at the ACLU New Jersey, where I focus on police, prosecutor, and prison reform. Before coming to the ACLU, I spent 8 years in the labor movement with the Culinary Workers Union out in Las Vegas, where I was the political director. And even before that, I am a formerly incarcerated person, which gives me the passion and the drive to keep doing this work. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion and bringing some of the skills I learned in the labor movement into this movement to see if we can bring more justice to New Jersey. Thanks, Amal.
Thanks, Jim. And last but not least, we've got Josh Moskowitz, my friend, who's a civil rights attorney and a partner at Hamilton Clark LLP. Josh?
Good evening, Amol. It's an honor to be here and part of this esteemed panel. As Amol said, I'm a civil rights attorney and a partner at the law firm Hamilton Clark. It's a social justice focused law firm with a Newark office on the near horizon. My career has been dedicated to representing people who have been abused by the police and whose civil and constitutional rights have been violated. I've represented members of the exonerated or Central Park Five and the family of Eric Garner, who was murdered by NYPD police officers on Staten Island in 2014 in a banned chokehold. I can say I agree wholeheartedly with Amol's introduction that this conversation needs to happen, and it's important that we're doing this. And I'm honored to be here today.
Thanks so much, Josh. So let's dive right in, and I welcome all of the panelists to bring their faces back to the screen and join us in the conversation here. I'll just note and start by noting that there's no way that we're going to talk about everything that we want to. We have a ton of expertise on this panel and limited time to demonstrate that expertise. So we'll get through as much of it as possible, but generally speaking, we're just going to be scratching the surface here. And there's a lot more to talk about and we can't possibly cover it in an hour. But I'll start with Reverend Boyer with my first question. Rev, Salvation and Social Justice is an extremely powerful organization, both in terms of policy, politics, law, and faith. And you work across numerous issues, including transforming the criminal legal system and transforming policing. So what are some of the priorities that Salvation and Social Justice is working on today?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. We work on various different things, like you said, many having to deal with kind of the entirety of the school to prison pipeline in many ways, really the cradle to the prison pipeline when referring to the Black community. So we deal with everything from health justice issues to inequities in the Black maternal health space to education issues and zero tolerance policies in schools. We're at the Trenton Board of Education tonight testifying on some things and trying to dig in. But specifically, I think for purposes of this conversation and to dig in a little deeper, we're working on various issues regarding the criminal legal system. We were part of the work that led to the directive from the Attorney General's office here in New Jersey for codifying the use of force. What we're working on is codifying it. It was a directive out of the Attorney General's office. And if not codified, it can be totally done away with. Now, with all that being said, we also feel it could have been stronger. So there's issues like around the use of canines, the use of tasers, the chokehold, et cetera, that we think can be strengthened much more. Also, we're working on issues trying to decriminalize the Black body. The Black body is immensely criminalized here in the state of New Jersey, specifically through the drug war. And so decriminalizing substance use in the state to us equates with decriminalizing Black bodies, especially since most of the punitive policies in place have been about keeping Black bodies in bondage. We're also looking at second look legislation. Right now, we have a severely aged and ailing population within New Jersey's prison system. We have, in effect, when we abolished the death penalty, all we really did was abolish it, abolishing using the needle or the electric chair, but we have, in effect, just killed people over time and through horrible healthcare within the prison systems. To the core of all of these issues to us, and we can talk about this a little bit later, is really creating alternatives to the current system that we have. And so for us, it's critically important that we begin to develop and fund alternative public safety models, particularly community-led first response when it comes down to issues of substance use, mental health, even violence interrupters, in order that over time, we will no longer even request or pick up the phone to call police in our communities, given the really abusive history that police have had within our community. So that is really the major piece for us. Accountability is one thing, but accountability is really a Band-Aid fix to something that is a much deeper systemic cancer in how it operates within our communities. And so that, I think, chief amongst the policies that we're working on, and I think relevant to this conversation.
Yeah, let's stop perpetrating the harm instead of just putting Band-Aids on the aftermath. I appreciate that. And you mentioned, I'm going to ask a quick follow-up. You mentioned the use of force directive by the Attorney General. Can you explain a little bit about why that was such an important moment in our state?
Yeah, so NJ.com, New Jersey Advanced Media. Well, actually, let me take you back even a little bit further. During the late 90s, early 2000s, really all throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, what had broke out nationally about the racial profiling scandal here in New Jersey from the state troopers, and how it broke and was widely shown that Black people were being pulled over disproportionately. Part of the federal oversight of New Jersey came the need or the requirement to do force reports. There was supposed to be a documentation of the use of force beyond just the state troopers, but through all the police departments in the state of New Jersey. And the racial data around how force was used was supposed to be documented in that process. Fast forward years later, those force reports were being done in a lot of cases, but there was no database system which was supposed to be developed as a result. New Jersey Advanced Media gets hold of all these records, some of which have mold, locked in basements, barely looked at, but all of these are self-reporting incidents of police and their use of force. And what that data showed was that Black people were 3 times more likely to be beaten, pepper sprayed, baton, bitten by dogs, tased, and shot, more so than white folks in the state of New Jersey. And this was the police's self-reporting. What that data also showed was that white folks were more likely to use force, violent force, on police than Black people. Black people were more likely to run, as we saw in Tyree Nichols' case. Of course, Black people are more likely to run because we are more likely to be killed. One of the things that we did in response to that was held hearings in Black churches all across the state to talk to the people who have been impacted by this violence. We were also, along with the ACLU at the time, advocating for the independent prosecutor bill, which ultimately came successfully as a result. And at that time, the Attorney General at that time was vociferously against the independent prosecutor bill. Fast forward to George Floyd. Well, we ended up getting the independent prosecutor passed. Fast forward to George Floyd, all of these things result in the use of force directive, curbing, and trying to get a hold on how force is used against citizens in the state and putting some kind of standards in place. And so now that is only in executive action and can be undone with the next administration and a new attorney general. And so that's the arc of history there, and why it's so critically important to codify it and strengthen it even more so than what it is.
That's right. And the use of force directive is, at the time that it was issued, I think was one of the most progressive in the country, in that it took a framework that said that it's incredibly important to make sure that we preserve life. It sounds very basic to say, right? That we preserve life every step of the way, and force should only be used as a last measure resort. And of course, there is a lot of work that needs to be done on that directive as well, and there's a lot of improvement that can be done in the process to codify it. But I totally agree with your point, Reverend. Nafisa, I'd love to ask you a question now, if I may. Your current role is at the intersection of youth and the criminal legal system, but you've always worked on reforming the criminal legal system, including improving prison conditions and decarcerating our prisons. From your perspective, what are some of the most pressing issues facing youth when it comes to policing?
Well, Amal, I'm just going to start with one thing, and that's trust. There is no trust. Young people do not trust that they are safe with police. And police, unfortunately, they don't. And there are initiatives, there are community-based initiatives where, police officers are doing community outreach, and that's great. It's necessary. But overall, when we look at the history of young people of color, Black people in particular, and police, it is all steeped in the fact that we have been abused. And not just abused, we've been murdered. And it happens constantly. If all you see on social media, and I'm just going to speak from a young person's perspective, right? I don't think they're sitting down watching the news, maybe, but just on social media, to see that another young Black person that looks like you or your cousin or has your brother's name was murdered again. That's devastating. And so trust is a major thing. There has to be bridges. There has to be communication. There has to be dialogue. Young people need to understand the law, which is the other, which is my second point. Our people do not understand the law. What applies to you? Where do you stand in it? And so what we do with Youth Functional Reform, we also teach, the Constitution to our young people. We have a program called STOP. Students, teachers, officers, and parents. And we want everyone to stop and let's start talking. And in these discussions, let's start building trust. And so when we understand who we are in our communities by understanding the law, then our young people, and especially with guidance, right? We cannot say, and this is, I love that Reverend Boyer mentioned the cradle to prison pipeline. But I'm going to stack on that a little bit. I'm going to say the womb to prison pipeline, because there are fetuses in prisons all across the nation. There are pregnant women who are incarcerated. There are children being conceived in prisons. I myself was one of them in Rawway. That's something that happened. But why, right? Why are these the conditions in which infants have to be exposed? And so they go on through their life and still not understanding, why is it that the color of their skin is their crime? And it all boils down to my last point, number 3, which is acceptance. We have to break the acceptance. When we look at our systems and the system of oppression, we can talk about, the racial climate. We can talk about all of these things, the economic climate. We can talk about these things, but it all boils down to individuals' acceptance of these systems and practices and ideologies as they exist. And so a part of what we do is we do not accept at all, right? And so when I talk to young people, and I talk to them about, what are their thoughts about law enforcement? A lot of them say that they would like to become police officers.
Mm.
Because they really want to show, right, what it should look like. What should policing look like in their communities? And that is, I did not think that is what I would hear, right? I thought I would hear more of, they're trying to kill us, we hate them. No, it was basically, we need to be policing, or we need to be servicing, right, our own people and our own communities. And when we look at nepotism, and we can talk about, police departments and how they do their hiring and how individuals are usually not from the same community, but it's necessary to have not only discussions with our young people, but our young people need to be at the table when it comes down to decision making, especially when it comes to laws that pertain to them, because they don't understand them. And that starts not in school, it starts in the home.
Nafisa, you remind me of something that that I've talked about a lot, which is that incarceration, and mass incarceration in particular, is a generational problem, right? It disrupts generational health, right? Like, we see not just the individual that's incarcerating facing the impact, but the family, the extended family, and that carries over for generation after generation because of a lack of resources and infrastructure and the ability to be with each other. And I know that during the Trump administration, we talked a lot about family separation in this country and what that was about in the immigration context. But we've been separating families for hundreds of years in this country within our borders. And that's something that isn't discussed enough, but I think your work touches on that. Great.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
No, I agree. And I just also think that there is an insensitivity when it comes to Black bodies and their families being disrupted.
Mm.
Now, if this was a different time and we're seeing white families being torn apart, a perfect example of that would be the tragedy of the Holocaust. We still shiver and cringe at the atrocities. But when it comes to Black bodies, the shivering and the cringing is coming from Black people. Others, are not so, they're not so sensitive when it comes down to a Black woman bringing her family to a prison to visit her son or her husband or her father. We're not looking at that mother who is crying and suffering every night because her baby, her 15-year-old, her 12-year-old, her 9-year-old was murdered senselessly.
Mm.
Yeah, it has to stop.
Thanks, Nafisa. Jim, I want to turn to you. At the ACLU of New Jersey, we've got a number of priorities related to policing and reforming the criminal legal system. Can you share some of those and also share, what are some of the obstacles that are getting in our way?
Sure. Thanks, Amal, and thanks again to NJPAC for inviting me on such an important and timely panel discussion. So transforming the criminal legal system is a tall task that can seem overwhelming at times. So I think it's helpful to break it down into short-term and long-term strategies. Long-term, we need to completely reimagine policing in the United States. The current criminal legal system is built on a foundation of white supremacy and will continue to uphold and reinforce it until we take bold action to change it. While I very much look forward to having that discussion, the painful reality is that we're not there yet. That's why I think we need to focus on more short-term goals that chip away at police power in this current moment and move us closer to our long-term goals. There are several short-term strategies that we can and should pursue to stop police violence, much like Reverend Boyer mentioned earlier, including limiting police encounters and non-law enforcement alternatives to policing, which I'm looking forward to hearing from Reverend Boyer later on. But tonight, I'd like to focus on two key bills that have been stalled in the New Jersey legislature for quite some time. The first is full police transparency. The second is strong civilian complaint review boards, or CCRBs. First, let's talk about transparency. While the AG has made some steps towards improving transparency, we need full transparency, which means internal affairs records accessible to the public, just like all government records. In 2020, George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin, an officer with a lengthy disciplinary record. Chauvin had 17 prior complaints, including 6 for violating use of force policies. More recently, several of the police that murdered Tyree Nichols had very problematic records of violence and misconduct on and off the force. It's scary to think how many officers are patrolling New Jersey communities right now with records of violence and misconduct. Full transparency means access to the actual records, not sanitized police narratives of misconduct that downplay the misconduct. The transparency bill has the potential to save lives right now, and we risk yet another act of police violence the longer we wait to take action. Second, we've also been fighting for strong civilian complaint review boards that have actual power, specifically subpoena power and concurrent investigation. Without these two crucial components, which must be passed legislatively, CCRBs in New Jersey risk becoming nothing but accountability theater, as we've seen in too many municipalities and states around the country. Strong CCRBs can give communities a voice on who they want patrolling their streets and the ability to hold violent or problematic officers accountable. CCRBs can be a powerful police accountability measure, but only if they have the sufficient power and resources. So these bills have been sitting on legislators' desks for over a year, some longer than that. So why is there no movement? Well, the answer is simple. It's the police lobby that has a stranglehold fiscally and politically on the legislature. Over just the past 5 years, the police lobby has donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to the same legislators that refuse to move these bills. To make matters worse, they have used their political power to not only block any bill with a hint of police accountability, but instead dust off old tough on crime bills that only throw fuel on the fire of mass incarceration. After the murder of George Floyd, many of these same legislators that are now blocking criminal legal reform bills put out statements denouncing the police violence that led to his murder. To those legislators, I have a simple message for you. Thoughts and prayers after police shooting are nice, but will do nothing to stop them in the future. Sympathy for victims will not decrease police violence. If that were the case, 2022 would not be a record-setting year for police killings. Third, what impact communities are demanding is real criminal legal reform that you and your colleagues have the power to pass right now. The situation when it comes to criminal legal reform of the legislature right now is bleak. However, that doesn't mean all is lost. ACLU New Jersey and many of our great partners are developing plans that we believe have the potential to change this dynamic at the legislature, which we'll talk about more later. While the police lobby might have all the money and all the power, we have the ability to organize our communities into a force capable of taking that power on. The seeds of this new political reality are already being planted in our New Jersey Communities for Accountable Policing Coalition, but we need new partners. So if you're on this call and you want to join the NJCAP Coalition, I will put my email in the chat and please send me an email. Lastly, it's a travesty that these bills have not even gotten a hearing yet, while so many regressive bills have. However, we have no time to waste complaining. We must create organizations capable of taking on the police lobby, and I'm optimistic with the hard work that we will get there. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Jim. Thanks for articulating our policy agenda so well. There's a lot there that you said, and I'm sure we'll touch on it throughout the conversation. I want to get to Josh real quick. Josh, as a civil rights litigator, you've sued police departments and city and state agencies over civil rights violations. One of the obstacles that litigators routinely face when suing police departments and police individually is qualified immunity, right, which is a legal doctrine. Could you describe your work and share with us a little bit about what qualified immunity is and why it's such an obstacle?
Certainly. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. To give some framework to discussing the concept of qualified immunity, I'll take a step back and explain the basic mechanism that civil rights attorneys like myself use to pursue justice for people who have been abused by the police. There are a number of federal laws that allow people who have been victims of police abuse to sue for the violations of their constitutional rights. The most well-known of those is a claim known as a Section 1983 claim, and that comes from the federal law where you will find that claim. There's a long history behind Section 1983. It was originally passed as part of the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 in an effort to help eradicate the growing terror of the Klan after the Civil War. And perhaps it marks how little we've come in this country, that it's still the prominent federal civil rights law that we use to bring justice for people who have been abused by the police themselves. Now, there's no mention of qualified immunity in Section 1983, but the Supreme Court has decided that government officials needed to be shielded from liability for violations of constitutional rights. And so they added what is now known as the defense of qualified immunity. Originally, its intent was to protect government officials who had acted in good faith. But today it serves as a boundless tool to shield government officials, even from some of the most outrageous conduct. There's a case that I can recall from California that went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where they held that it wasn't clearly established, and therefore officers were entitled to qualified immunity, meaning they wouldn't be held liable for stealing property that was seized pursuant to a warrant. And the court found that the Constitution didn't make it clear that officers couldn't do that. So it is now used too often to protect officers who have not acted in good faith, and has become a serious impediment to pursuing legitimate civil rights claims. Now, fortunately, there are still cases in courts that will apply the law fairly, so that people who have been abused by the police are able to pursue legitimate claims. There also is a growing movement to eradicate qualified immunity. Notably, New York City adopted a law several years ago that allows a Fourth Amendment claim to be brought in state courts in New York, and where there's no qualified immunity available. Unfortunately, those claims are still not pursued directly against officers. So whether or not it has any effect on curbing bad police officers is unclear, perhaps unlikely. But it does mean at least that people who have been the victim of police abuse will be able to seek some measure of justice and not be left totally unaccounted for.
Thanks, Josh. I mean, it seems like with the combination of having qualified immunity in the legal front blocking accountability, then having the police lobby potentially on the policy front blocking accountability, there's really limited avenues for people to seek that accountability that we have here. Do you agree with that? Like there just seems to be a real a real challenge to disrupting the status quo.
I certainly agree with that from the context of the court system and from litigation. I think it's the weakest tool that's available, but it is still a tool. I always think of my job as supporting the work of people like Reverend Boyer. We're here to try and use the legal tools that are available to us to bring justice to people and to force change when, in the rare case, we have a judge or a court case that will allow us to do that. But we work with what we have available, and I agree that our avenues are limited.
Thanks, Josh. I'm going to open it up a little bit and and ask a couple of questions to the group. But before I do, I just wanted to remind folks that are watching that you should feel free to drop questions in the chat or in the Q&A function, and we'll address them throughout the conversation and reserve some time at the end as well. So please feel free to ask your questions in written form in the chat. I suppose this question is probably most appropriate for Reverend Boyer and for Nafisa. So while New Jersey has a long way to go, as we talked about on some reforms, as I mentioned at the outset, we've had some success in improving our criminal legal system in this state over the years. We've reduced the use of solitary confinement. We've significantly decarcerated our prisons, and we've effectively eliminated cash bail. But we don't yet have simple things like our colleagues here mentioned, like CCRB or police discipline transparency, and we continue to have the worst racial disparities in our prisons in the country. From your perspective, Reverend Boyer and Nafisa and the other panelists as well, if you choose to, what's behind this, both the good and the bad? You know, how is it that we accomplish the good things that we've been able to accomplish and still haven't done the things that are so basic and fundamental and a matter of good government, right, that we are still pushing for?
Yeah, so I guess I'll give that a shot. I guess if I really knew that answer, we wouldn't even have to ask the question. Yeah, I think what happens in New Jersey is what has always happened throughout the totality of the American story, which is, you know, when we make strides, when we make progress, there is a visceral, you know, particularly when you make any kind of progress that gets Black people free in any kind of way, there is a really vociferous, violent white backlash to it. And that's just what it is. And our political figures are extremely much more sensitive to the racist faction of the white vote than they are typically to doing right by Black people. And that's just what that's really what it is. So it's never really about doing the right thing as much as it is how much political cover do we have at the moment to do any given thing. And so, for instance, whether, I mean, as you know, Amal, you know, solitary confinement, it took years, many years.
13 years or so.
Exactly. I mean, I got into that fight about the halfway. I don't even know if it was maybe a little bit more than the halfway point, and it was forever for me. And so to think about how long that took, the same with independent prosecutors, the same with the use of force directive. The one piece that I would say was still part of a much longer fight and battle, but really was a extremely unique moment in time, was the prison releases, which was just unthinkable in New Jersey, right? It was just unthinkable anywhere. But the pressure was so incredible in the pandemic. In New Jersey, we did the right thing in nationally publicly shaming New Jersey, because real time it was holding the #1 spot in killing people in prisons in the pandemic. And typically our lawmakers, I don't want to say all of them, but typically what New Jersey responds to is a national public shaming or a national gravitation to national headlines. So if you look at whatever policies are taking place in New Jersey, it's usually in response, and typically it's in response as Democrats are trying to get known nationally for whatever the Republican establishment is doing nationally. And so I mean, I don't want to get ultra deep, but typically they chase the headlines. And that's what we see a lot of, and they chase kind of the national platform as opposed to really getting. So nationally, we saw a pullback from policing. You definitely saw that in New Jersey, and in some ways, particularly in New Jersey, it's even worse because people assume New Jersey is very progressive, when New Jersey has always been, I mean, known as the slave state of the North. And that kind of real racist faction, New Jersey having amongst the leads, the leading hate group is amongst the leaders in the emergence of hate groups and racist activity online in the country. It is one of the most racist places in the United States, and people just don't realize it. And that is who holds voting power in the state. And so whether you're looking at the assembly or various districts, these are some of the things that really hold weight and hold progress back.
That's right. Nafisa, anything to add there?
All I could say is Reverend Boyer definitely he said it, but if there's one thing that I would add, it would be implementation. It's a failure to implement these laws. You know, when the Isolated Confinement Restriction Act was passed, we were like, whoo, yes, finally, right? You're talking about 2 administrations, but not so much on the implementation side, right? And so with coalitions specifically, like Prison Justice Watch and Salvation and Social Justice organizations that are out here in the forefront and they're fighting, it is exhausting, right? Because even though we know that we're fighting for the right thing, it makes sense. But to try to convince lawmakers that it makes sense, it's like, I don't know, I'd rather watch paint dry on the wall. And so why is it that in 2023 we're still having these discussions around Blacks and brown people still being abused by police and laws that still protect these individuals from doing for doing these acts? And so it's sad. It's very, very sad. But once again, it just also shows us that there is more to policy than just, creating it. We really have to have language that is matter of fact around how, these laws will be implemented. And so for me, I would say implementation is the key.
That's
That's
a
what
really
I'm
good,
feeling.
yeah, that's a really good point, Nafisa. That the fact that we pass a law isn't the end of the story. What we need is to make sure that we monitor implementation to hold the institution accountable, not just to the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, to make sure that we're doing exactly what it is that the people wanted, which was to severely reduce the use of solitary confinement and not just call it something else when we do the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, well said. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to turn to Jim and Josh for a sec. In the 80s and 90s, we saw that the war on drugs and tough on crime rhetoric led to policies that really fueled and accelerated mass incarceration, right? The United States became notorious for having only 5% of the world's population, but something like 25% of the world's prison population. And over the last decade or so, we saw a bit of a shift. There was more of an awareness on the impact of incarceration in the world. There was more of an awareness of the racial impact of incarceration on our communities. And we saw crime decreasing in just about every category in this country. But now, over the past 2 years or so, it seems like history is repeating itself, and we have tough on crime mindsets back and leading to policy proposals to potentially fuel yet another era of mass incarceration. So from your perspective, Jim and Josh, why do you think that we're seeing this continued push for tougher policies in recent months, especially those that will disproportionately impact Black communities, right? We hear a lot about quote unquote car thefts, which I think is a loaded term for arresting Black folks. Why do you think this is happening, and what should we do about it?
Jim, I'm happy to jump in, and or if you'd like to go first. So, I mean, I think that the simplest answer was the one that Reverend Boyer gave earlier. It's politics, right? It's politics, and it's what's available. So politics is that people who vote and the desire to get those votes are afraid when they see headlines about crime, right? And so what are their options? Their options are limited, right? Reverend Boyer talked about something that's not revolutionary. But it doesn't get the attention that it should, which is an alternative to policing in this country. I mean, there are some incredible organizations out there who have been pushing for alternatives for policing forever. But certainly today, there are many of them that have thoughtful, sophisticated policy proposals who are talking about that we don't need a person with a badge and a gun responding to every incident, right? If someone has a family member who's going through a mental health crisis, we don't need someone there with handcuffs, right? It only makes the situation worse. And so there are very few alternatives, and it's such an easy political point to score when when the news says crime is up, right? Which is really just whatever manipulation of data is useful that week, that people can turn to, and it's deeply disturbing. And it feels like even if it's one step forward, it's 50 steps back. I mean, in New York City, for instance, and you can see why it plays out there is, you know, who have we elected, right? We have a mayor in New York City who's former police captain, right? He turns to what he knows. And so, you know, what's one of the first things that Eric Adams did when he came in? He said, I'm going to bring back anti-crime, right? The anti-crime unit, just remember, this is pretty fascinating. The anti-crime unit was a unit that was largely responsible for the vast majority of stop and frisk in New York City. And stop and frisk were found by a federal judge after a 6-week trial to be unconstitutionally aimed at young Black men, right? And one of the most incredible pieces of testimony in that case, and I was one of the lawyers on the case, was Eric Adams came into court and testified himself when he was the borough president in Brooklyn. He heard Ray Kelly say publicly, the point of stop and frisk was that young Black men should be afraid when they step out on the street that they might be frisked so that they'll leave their guns at home. That was testimony that our current mayor gave, and is now the one saying we should bring back the anti-crime unit. And the history of the anti-crime unit, I don't need to go on about, but you know, they're the follow-on unit to the street crimes unit, which was responsible for gunning down Amadou Diallo. I mean, there's no reason that any humane person would say we should bring back the anti-crime unit, but that's what's available, right? And that's what people have as an option. There are no options.
Thanks, Josh. Jim, any thoughts to add on there?
Yeah, sure. 3 points that I would like to add on to what Josh just said. The first is building on the first point he made. You know, too often in our newspapers, we're not getting real reports. A lot of times we're getting propaganda, right? We're getting basically police reports and police quotes put into the paper. Our legislators are reading that and come to believe that there's this massive crime wave, right? So I think that that's one component that we need to call out, right? It is the reporting on crime, right? There's a lot of what I would call propaganda in the media that feeds into the legislators, you know, feeling like they need to do this. The second point I'd like to make is once again, I want to bring it back to why are we seeing this stuff again? The main reason again is the police lobby. And, you know, the reason they're bringing this back is because they believe in the racist drug war. They believe in the racist era of mass incarceration. They truly believe in this. So they are once again throwing around their money and their power to bring back these regressive bills. And I think that there's the third point I want to make, I think the best example of this troubling era that we're in right now is a few weeks ago, the legislator heard bills in committees that would increase penalties for fentanyl. And, you know, everybody, I'm pretty sure everybody on this call is on the same page that we want to decrease all opioid overdoses by any means necessary, right? But criminalization is not the way. It wasn't the answer 20 years ago. It's certainly not the answer now. And the thing that's more troubling is the fear mongering around fentanyl is reminiscent of the crack cocaine fear mongering that was used to accelerate the war on drugs and mass incarceration in the 80s and 90s. And we know the results will be the same. More incarcerated people not getting the help they need, which will continue the vicious cycle of incarceration that many people now experience. Once again, instead of dusting off old tough on crime bills of the 80s and 90s, let's be bold and brave enough to admit that the war on drugs is an absolute failure and change course. If New Jersey truly wants to address the overdose death crisis, we must invest in evidence-based public health solutions like harm reduction, housing, employment, not more punishment that only makes the problem worse. And then once again, we cannot criminalize our way to public safety. We just can't. Rather, we need to come up with new public safety measures that actually address the root causes of crime and come up with new solutions that don't involve more criminalization. It might be a little bit harder work, but it is well worth it, right? And by no means will this work be easy or without peaks and valleys, but I'm very optimistic that if we continue to fight each and every day for a more just New Jersey, that it will come. We just need to keep fighting each and every day to make it happen.
You know, Amal, if I could just
Please.
lean into it, because I really appreciate how Jim and Joshua summed all this. It just makes, you know, I have yet to see any community that has been policed to peace or prosperity.
Mm.
And the most peaceful and the most prosperous communities in the United States have the least amount of police. And the fact that anyone can even try to rationalize differently is the evidence of a colonized slave master mentality. It really is the exacerbation of a slave patrol model. And policing as we know it is all about profiting from incarcerating and fining the Black body. And until we get to a place where we resource Black communities, house and help and bring health in Black communities at the levels of white communities, we will always be, and we will stand as an unrighteous, immoral, ignorant, and insidious state and nation. And the last piece I would say is this, because, you know, there's always this, you know, kind of defund the police and kind of how we don't want to offend the police and all these things. And listen, the relationships are complicated, right? I have family in law enforcement and all these things, so it's super complicated. But I always say that all of that's a red herring. Let's just even start here. Can we even start with the premise that we fund alternatives to policing and fund communities even at the same level as we do police and prisons? Can we even just start there? And let's see what happens. I challenge the politicians, the holders of power, just do that. And let's see what happens. Because and make sure that we do it for as long as we have been funding these harmful systems. Because it can't just be a 1 year time and then say, let's see what happens. Fund it for the decades upon decades upon decades that we have been funding police at these levels. And when we do that, I guarantee you that we actually solve, but there is no interest in solving the crime problem. There's no interest in that. I like how Jim put it. It's propaganda, because it's all about continuing to fund and resource generations of people that have a stronghold on the police industry by profiting off of Black bodies.
Powerful. Thank you, Reverend. You know, you mentioned defund the police. There's been no police department that has been defunded or even significantly impacted in the United States. There has been no reduction or meaningful reduction of dollars going towards policing. In fact, I was talking to a council member recently from an unnamed city, and they were telling me that it is easier to take $1 away from any department under their jurisdiction, but they can't touch the police budget. And when people are talking about defund or reimagining policing or finding alternatives, they're not saying do away with public safety. They're saying try to imagine a world where public safety doesn't just depend on this one agency. Try to imagine a world where public safety doesn't just depend on a person with a gun. Sometimes, as Josh was saying, you just need a tow truck, right? You don't need a person with a gun to show up. And, you know, it reminds me of the fact that I don't know the full history of this phenomenon in the United States, but so there may be some things that I'm missing here, but it reminds me of the fact that in the United States, we decided hundreds of years ago that we needed a specialized force to put out fires, literally put out fires. We needed to create a fire department because the police couldn't do that job. And we needed special skills, special tools, special personnel to be able to do that. And we decided to create that as a separate entity in the United States. They don't have guns. They don't show up and escalate situations. They're actually there to literally put out fires. Now, isn't there something to be learned from that? Why is it that we started investing repeatedly over and over and doubling down on that investment in police and asked them to do everything under the umbrella, right? Perhaps those of us with law enforcement in our families and in our close friends can understand that we are asking police to do perhaps too much, that they're ill-equipped to do all of those things, and that any person in that situation can be overwhelmed and resort to unjust acts. So it's a system that has been designed to fail, and it certainly has shown us that it can fail, and unfortunately at the loss of life and the risk and harm perpetrated on Black and brown communities across the United States. But I'm not a panelist, and I'm sorry I took a bit of time to explain my thoughts there. But I wanted to wrap up here with one last question before I turn to the Q&A here. What is it that folks can do to get involved in your work? How can we, as community members, start to get involved? And I think I'll start with Jim first.
Thanks, Amal. So as I mentioned earlier, I have a labor background. So I worked for 8 years in the labor movement. So my top 3 answers are organize, organize, and organize, right? And what I would say to people on this call is that I think many times when we're reading or listening to panels like this, we often think that you need a special skill set or need to know someone to become an organizer. And I could tell you that nothing could be further from the truth, right? You can always become a better organizer, but anybody, any community member that has a passion for these issues can become an organizer. So just very quickly, what I would say to folks, if they want to get involved and help, a quick and easy way to become an organizer, and I learned this on one of my first days at the union, was you get a list of 20 people, right? And those 20 people become your 20 people, right? You own those 20 people. That sounds right. You own that list to organize those 20 people on that list on the subject, right? And on this issue, what I would do is have them call their legislature, right? And then through those 20 people, you should be able to find at least 3 to 4 people that are really passionate about it, that you can then give them their list of 20, and keep going like that, right? And I think that in the short term, we can, force a lot of change because we all know what these politicians care most about, and that's keeping that seat, right? And if they start getting calls from their constituents asking them why they're getting bulldozed by the police lobby every day of the week and not being accountable to their actual community members, I think that we can actually make a difference. And, when I was in the labor movement, there was some times when we got into some big fights, and I can tell you that when a legislator gets about 150 phone calls from constituents a day telling them how bad a bill is, their opinions can change quite quickly, right? So I would say organizing and just keeping pressure on the legislators, right? They do not deserve a break at this point, and we have to keep the pressure up. So organize, and keep the pressure on them would be my answer.
Thanks, Jim. Nafisa, how can people get involved in your work?
Well, hopefully we can put the website up, www.youthfunctionoverform.org. We are always looking for volunteers to help us with our peer-to-peer mentoring, as well as our welcome home housing. We have to really be able to make sure that our young people are getting the support that they need. We cannot rely on, schools, and we just can't rely on parenting, right? It takes a village. It really does. And all of us have a responsibility to keep our children free. Too many generations have gone on and have been affected and wear the scars of their great, 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 great grandparents in their DNA. When we talk about our young people and just how they do not trust law enforcement, we really have to think, how can you feel safe living in a world or living in a community where the ones who are supposed to protect you are the ones that you fear the most? They're not running from gang members, they're running from the police. That's really, really frightening. And so I just think that for individuals who really want to get involved, reach out to us. And like my brother just said, organizing, right? We have to organize, and I have an organizer background as well. And it's for anything that we're doing, right? You have to understand power. So I would, want to say that, if you're interested in understanding how to make the changes, then definitely reach out to these organizations and coalitions to understand who are the power people, who are the targets. Sometimes our folks don't really know who is the person you need to be reaching out to. And so by understanding, who individuals are, we can not only organize people with that list of 20, right? We can also organize money, because it takes money. We cannot forget that, right? And so if you're serious and you know that there are changes that must be made for you, your family, the future of our nation, and you want to be involved, then definitely reach out to us, because we're all about preserving our future through the youth. I do work with the adult population who's incarcerated, and I've seen many lose their lives in the battle. When we talk about fentanyl and we think about all of the individuals who were incarcerated and came home, and because of lack of resources, they OD, they die. There's too many things, too many crises that's going on in our nation. And when we just buckle down and we say, hey, this is the one thing that I am really concerned about and I want to do something about, then you can become a part of that change. We have to understand there's too many issues on the plate. We can't tackle them all. But if you find that one that you can put your energy in, then get on board, because we need you. We need you. We need you. And you need this. You need this, meaning power. We have to bring power back to the hands of the people. It has been removed. And when we understand just how powerful we are, then we know that we cannot be stopped and we will not be broken. And we can see that through the how many years of the ICRA, right? Fighting for that to get passed, fighting for other pieces of legislation to get passed. I mean, it takes time, but when we're talking about fighting for what's right in humanity, all we have is time.
Thanks, Nafisa. Josh, what can people do?
So I'll speak about what I know and my area, which is to speak up and speak out, and don't let abuses that you've suffered go unspoken. If that requires contacting a lawyer, someone like me, to help you with doing that, then do that. I mean, speaking truth to power is hard, but if you don't, then it's allowed to fester. And related to that is support your family members, your community members, your friends who are going through difficult situations, if they've been victims of police abuse, whether they're going through litigation or simply dealing with their own mental stress of needing to heal from that. Support them. It's really difficult. I've seen so many clients who have struggled in so many aspects of their life after a situation of police abuse. I mean, the idea of having that come upon yourself for a lot of folks, even if they're well aware of it, it's really debilitating, and it really rocks your life. And so support, people who are going through those difficult times, and do what you can to help them through it.
Thanks, Josh. And Reverend Boyer, what can people do?
Yeah, so our one is to help lift up the various policy priorities that we've lifted up here tonight. Salvation and social justice as the 2023 policy priorities document, which has been put into the chat. Particularly relevant to this discussion is our kind of what we called our Return and Restore campaign, which has most of our criminal legal pieces underneath there. And so please, as Jim laid out masterfully, please reach out to your legislators, organized people. Also, I think what can be made available in the chat, particularly we put a lot of effort into educating Black church communities on these issues and working within those areas where Black churches are concentrated to do two things. One, to understand this from a faith context and from a theological lens, but also to activate those communities to call and be activated with their local elected officials on these issues. And so certainly if you are a Black person of faith, even if you ain't been to church in a long time, but you know where your core is, I think these tools that we have will be useful, as they're useful for faith leaders, they're useful for people of faith to help us kind of think theologically about these things. So particularly around police accountability, we have three tools. One is a theological, what we call pulpit toolkits. It's a theological framing to help frame. There's a historical analysis of the Black faith response to policing in the state of New Jersey, from the Underground Railroad to racial profiling to the current day. That could be very helpful. And then there's the policy toolkit, on which includes scripts, social media pieces, all kinds of ways that you can engage, that you can activate and motivate your elected officials to lean in. So we'll make sure that those pieces are in the chat. Also, if you're not from a Black faith community, but you're part of a faith community, you have access to lawmakers that we typically don't, because we're deeply connected with the Black Legislative Caucus and in urban areas, in various areas throughout the state. But certainly, even though these tools may not be directly for your context, they are still useful, and we hope that other faith communities would take these and mimic them for their context, and create their own version. And so we highly encourage that. I'll also make sure that our general email address, which you can get at info@sandsj.org, is in the chat as well. so that you can reach out and we can get you connected to the right staff person for various questions and ways to lean in.
Thanks so much, Reverend. So we do have some questions here, and I see that somebody has a hand up, but I would ask them to just put a type a question into the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll take it there. But a question that we have is, how are the existing civilian complaint review boards in New Jersey doing? What's their performance appraisal, they ask, and what improvements would you recommend? I think that might be, for New Jersey, I think that might be a good question for Jim and perhaps Reverend Boyer. But I also wonder if, Josh, you might be able to talk about the New York Civilian Complaint Review Board, if you have any experience there. If not, that's fine. I just wanted to pose the question. But please, Jim, Reverend Boyer, whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, sure. I can start. So I think it's worth noting first that the way the original CCRB was set up in Newark was set up to be a model for the country. And what happened is the FOP sued to take away the things that would have made it a model for the country. So my answer is that the CCRB, they are working as hard as they can with the resources they have. But as I stated earlier, we have to fight as hard as we can to get them subpoena power and concurrent investigations, because without that, what it becomes is like I said earlier, it just becomes accountability theater, right? And if there's just way too many cities and CCRBs that have been set up around the country that didn't have the right powers and weren't set up the right way, and really just turn into a mess, right? It turns into civilians investigating a case for months and months, and they get to the conclusion and they make recommendations to the police officers and they file it away, and that's it. You know what I mean? So what my answer is that we have the right people in place, but what we need is the right powers in place, right? And that's another reason to fight for A1515, which is the Assembly Bill number, CCRBs that would give them the subpoena power and concurrent investigations. And just real quickly, just why that's important. One is the subpoena power is incredibly important for obvious reasons. If you're investigating a case of police violence, you need to be able to have access to witnesses and other people that witnessed that event. And secondly, the concurrent investigations are extremely important as well, is because many times internal affairs, when they get a case like this, it can take years for them to finish it, right? And then what happens is that report gets sent to the CCRB 3 years after the incident took place, which makes it nearly impossible for the CCRB to go back, find witnesses and stuff like that. So my answer is we have the potential and we have the model in place to be the model for the country. We just need our legislators to act with a little bit of courage and get it done so that we can get started.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jim laid it out perfectly, so I won't add too much to that. I'll just kind of throw in something that I wanted to stress before but forgot. But again, particularly important is it, and please reach out to legislators and especially in this current time when it's budget season in New Jersey, really stress the need for the funding of community-led alternatives. So right now, the strongest versions of that is in and amongst the violence interrupters throughout the state and the harm reduction entities throughout the state. So these are getting at two pieces around, that policing has a really stronghold on. So you have entities like the North Community Street Team, Patterson Healing Collective, Salvation and Social Justice in the city of Trenton is doing violence interruption. There's various entities throughout the state doing this work. And more resources need to go into these places to create an infrastructure of an alternative. And I particularly say, and I think to Nafisa's point, when young people are saying, I want to go into policing, and what she was hearing, they really wanted to create public safety models for themselves, take ownership and autonomy and sovereignty of our own communities, which is critically important as the longer term, most crucial solution to this issue. And I can't stress that enough. And the immediate need to build that infrastructure starting today is so vitally important. And I would argue one of the most, if not the most critically important way to get at this issue for the long term.
And I'll add the point from my experience of the CCRB in New York City, which is that I agree wholeheartedly with Jim's point that power, that the CCRB needs to have power in order to be functional or useful. But even with that power, I think that there's a tremendous limitation that you'll always find in CCRBs, and that brings me to support completely what Reverend Boyer is saying, that there are better avenues to get what we want. CCRBs can be useful. In New York City, they have the power to prosecute. There was one person who was prosecuted by the CCRB for the on video murder of Eric Garner, and it took 5 years for that to happen, right? It took 5 years, and even then the police commissioner had to confirm that. And so as much as that was an outcome that needed to happen, it doesn't bode well for the fact that only one person was prosecuted by CCRB for that atrocious. I mean, it was a murder that we all watched. So I support what Reverend Boyer is saying. There are other things that are better, I think, than more powerful CCRBs.
You know, in the course of the history of the Newark CCRB, which was, as Jim mentioned, designed to be a model for the whole country, after reviewing what other cities had done and trying to take the best pieces of certain CCRBs and building our own infrastructure for it. You know, in the course of that history, after the police union sued, the Supreme Court of New Jersey wrote an opinion that was essentially a roadmap for the things that were missing from state law that disabled the CCRB. And so that didn't allow it to do the job that it was meant to do. And so what the policy that Jim mentioned that we're trying to get through the state legislature is essentially an answer to the call from the state Supreme Court, which said, you know, here are the things that need to be in law in order for us to be able to uphold a CCRB that has all of these powers. And so we're just trying to answer the call here, right? And make sure that communities have the tools that they need in order to hold their own police accountable. And it may not be right for every single community in the country or in the state. Maybe there are some communities that don't want to have a CCRB because they don't have the right infrastructure for it, right? Because what we don't want to have is a CCRB that is toothless, that is without the right composition, because if you don't have advocates on the CCRB or community informed people or people who are a part of the community themselves or directly impacted people, you're going to end up with, you know, as Jim put it, accountability theater, right? Like just a body that doesn't actually do anything, but rather is able to say that they put up something, right? And we don't want that. I don't see any other questions, but I wanted to take a moment to just say a couple of things. One is that you know, I think at the root of this conversation is that we ought to stop thinking about the symptoms and start thinking about the disease. There are real root causes to this problem, and instead of simply asking ourselves and our communities and our lawmakers to repair, what we should be doing is stopping the perpetration of harm to begin with. And so it's really important that we think about who and what are the elements in our society that are causing the harm, and how can we stop them from happening. Secondly, I just wanted to share, you know, from the ACLU's perspective, there are tons of ways to get involved in our work in calling for a more just and equitable state. Of course, there's work that you can find on or volunteer opportunities that you can find through peoplepower.org and the ACLU website in New Jersey and nationally. There are opportunities for you to sign up for our listserv and stay informed of action items that happen. So we make it super easy for you to fill out a form that will allow you to send a message to your lawmaker immediately when there are key moments. But there are tons of organizations all over the state and all over the country that are doing good work. I'm going to lift up Salvation and Social Justice, of course, Youth Functional Reform, Prison Justice Watch in New Jersey. Reverend Boyer mentioned the Newark Community Street Team. There's so many institutions out there. The New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, the Immigrant Alliance. There's so many institutions out there that I want to lift up, but I can't name them all, and I feel badly because I feel like I'm doing a disservice by not listing them all. But please check out their websites. Go online, donate to those organizations as well, and support them every step of the way because they're doing the important work of trying to make our state a more just and more equitable one. And with that, I just want to take a moment to thank our esteemed panel. Thank you, Reverend Boyer, Josh, Jim, and Nafisa for being such righteous panelists and such righteous partners in the struggle for justice. Really appreciate each and every one of you and really look forward to continuing our work together. And of course, I want to thank NJPAC for hosting us and PSEG for sponsoring the series. Because I think these are important conversations that need to be had. And thank you to NJPAC for giving us the platform to do it. So with that, I'll turn it back to my colleague, Donna.
Thank you. Thank you, panel, for such a critical, inspiring, and action-motivated discussion. That's exactly what we wanted and need. And thank you, Mo, for always bringing such expertise and intelligence to our social justice panel discussions. We really appreciate everything that you all are doing. And I hope that our listeners are inspired as to what they can do. And yes, we also deeply appreciate the support of PSEG that enables us to produce this monthly series. So I'd like to invite all of our audience members to join us next month in March. Our next social justice panel is titled Writing with Fire. This is in celebration of Women's History Month. And we're going to focus on one key area, and that is, the right freedom of speech, free press, and the power of journalists to transform their communities. The film that we're going to use hopefully will capture some of the spirit and bravery of journalists around the world. And then our panelists are going to share their ideas on how we can affect change and chip away at systems of oppression. So that's next month on March 20th, same time. And then, of course, you saw our slide at the beginning. If you have children or know of some children, join us for Ailey Camp, Ailey Day, rather. I'm sorry, that's going to be coming up soon. Also, our summer programs will begin. We have our popular jazz jams that are always completely full. So these are events that just are part of what we do at NJPAC. And thank you so much for all your support and interest. Everyone, please have a wonderful evening. Thank you.